The rusted padlock on the garage door would not budge. I stood there in the dark with 2 duffel bags and a flashlight I had bought at a gas station 40 miles back, and I could not even get inside. I sat on the cracked concrete steps and listened to the desert wind. It battered against the corrugated tin my grandfather had bolted together when I was 7. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last night my ex-wife would ever treat me like an asset she could easily discard. If you found yourself standing in the ruins of what you thought was your life, while your ex walked away with everything else you built together, would you have swallowed your pride to keep the peace? Or would you have fought back when you realized the game was rigged? I would like to hear your perspective in the comments because my choice changed everything. The cold in the desert cut straight to the bone. I woke up shivering on a canvas cot, staring up at the exposed rafters of Grandpa Elias's vintage auto restoration garage. Dust motes drifted through shafts of pale morning light, settling over rusted engine blocks and dry earth. This 50-acre patch of Nevada scrubland was the entirety of my new empire. The divorce had been brutally efficient. Vanessa was a corporate acquisitions consultant, and she handled the dissolution of our marriage the exact same way she handled a hostile takeover. She took the newly renovated house in the suburbs. She took the joint savings accounts. She took the mutual funds we had spent 12 years building. I was left with a settlement check for $22,500 and the deed to this forgotten garage, a property her attorneys had formally classified as having negligible market value. Looking back now, I realize how completely I had played into her hands. I had accepted the meager payout without a single argument in court. We are often taught that stepping away quietly, taking the financial hit to avoid a protracted battle, is the dignified way to handle a separation. I thought surrendering the assets to keep the peace made me the bigger man. It took me months to understand the trap of the quiet exit. Vanessa was not grateful for the smooth transition. She viewed my desire to avoid conflict as a glaring vulnerability, a psychological lever she could pull to legally bankrupt me. My silence was not a shield. It was simply an invitation for her to strip our life together down to the foundation. I spent those first few days moving like a ghost through the shop. I ate canned chili cold straight from the tin because I had not figured out the ancient propane stove yet. I swept decades of red dust off the cracked concrete floor, meticulously organizing Elias's old wrenches and socket sets. There was a steady mechanical comfort in the heavy iron tools and the absolute isolation. I was not plotting any sort of retaliation. I was just deeply tired. I was a man trying to find a baseline in the wreckage, accepting that my marriage had never been a partnership, but rather a long-term corporate merger where I had eventually been liquidated. I thought the transaction was closed. I thought the bleeding had stopped. I was pushing a heavy bristle broom near the main bay entrance when the bristles caught on something thick and rigid. I reached down and pulled a crisp white envelope from the dirt. It had been shoved under the gap in the rusted metal door. The return address bore the embossed crest of Vanessa's corporate law firm. I tore it open, wiping engine oil from my hands onto a shop rag. Inside was a formal contract and a cover letter detailing a limited time offer. $50,000 to purchase the garage and the surrounding acreage outright, presented as a personal favor just to help me get back on my feet. If I am being honest, I almost laughed. For 12 years, I had watched Vanessa operate from the inside. She did not do charity, and she certainly did not hand out capital to depreciating assets. To her, money was never a gift. It was a mechanism of control. The letter insisted I had 48 hours to sign before the generous offer expired. That was the tell. Manipulation always thrives on artificial urgency. When someone demands you make a permanent decision before you have time to calculate the variables, they're usually trying to prevent you from realizing what you actually hold. I left the contract sitting on the edge of a rusted tool cart and went back to work. I had decided to tackle Grandpa Elias's old steel filing cabinets, dragging them away from the back wall to sweep out the accumulated desert debris. Behind the third cabinet sat a heavy, chrome, vintage Ford grille, wrapped partially in a thick canvas tarp. As I moved it to clear the space, I noticed a thick manila envelope taped securely to the back of the metal frame. It was closed with a dark red wax seal, the kind nobody uses anymore. Before I could pry it loose, my phone vibrated against the workbench. The screen displayed Vanessa's name. I let it ring 4 times before hitting the accept button and putting it on speaker. Julian, did you get the courier package? Her voice was clipped, carrying that familiar, impatient cadence of someone who is used to managing subordinates on a tight deadline. I received a letter, I said. Good, you need to sign the transfer documents today. My firm is willing to expedite the $50,000. It is a clean exit, Julian. You can take that cash and actually start over somewhere functional, but the firm will pull the offer if you delay. I picked up a microfiber towel and carefully wiped down a socket wrench. I listened to the forced tension in her voice. For the first time in over a decade, her manufactured panic completely failed to move me. I am currently rebuilding a carburetor, I said, keeping my tone entirely flat. I do not have time to read your paperwork right now. I tapped the screen to end the call before she could draw another breath. The silence that rushed back into the garage felt fundamentally different. It felt like leverage. I set the phone down and picked up my grandfather's envelope. I wedged a flathead screwdriver under the flap, breaking the brittle wax seal. A thick stack of watermarked state documents slid heavily onto the workbench. The paper felt dense, carrying that distinct dry scent of bureaucratic archives, kept in the dark for decades. I am not a lawyer, but I know how to read a mechanical schematic. I sat down on an overturned milk crate and started tracing the lines of text, mapping out the architecture of what Grandpa Elias had actually built. The documents were dated 1988. He had not just purchased 50 acres of barren Nevada scrubland. He had legally registered the commercial rights to the deepest, most stable underground aquifer in the entire valley. And he had done it just 3 years before the state permanently locked on all new commercial water claims. I realized then why Vanessa's high-priced attorneys had missed this during the discovery phase. The rights weren't registered under Elias's name personally. They were held by a defunct hauling company he'd closed decades ago. In the world of corporate acquisitions, if a record isn't in a searchable digital database, it doesn't exist. She had been so focused on the digital balance sheet that she never bothered to look at the physical history buried in the dust. At the time, I did not fully grasp the massive scale of what I was holding. I just knew that water in the high desert was heavy currency. But as I read the exact parcel coordinates, a low, methodical hum started putting the pieces together in my mind. I reached over and turned up the volume on the battered radio sitting on the shelf. The local news had been running the same story all week. A major tech conglomerate, Vanessa's exact employer, was breaking ground on a $750 million mega data center right on the county line. Our property line, data centers run dangerously hot. They require massive, uninterrupted cooling infrastructure to keep the server racks from melting down. They need water, millions of gallons of it. And my grandfather owned the only untouchable grandfather commercial tap into the basin. I looked at the $50,000 buyout contract Vanessa had sent, still sitting on the edge of the tool cart. It was not a generous offer to help an ex-husband start over. It was a desperate, quiet acquisition tactic. She was trying to secure the single asset her company needed to finalize their infrastructure, and she was trying to steal it from me for fractions of a penny on the dollar by weaponizing my desire to keep the peace. It is a strange feeling to realize that true leverage is often buried deep underneath the exact things superficial people consider worthless. Vanessa looked at this property and saw rusted tin and dead dirt. She saw a man she could easily discard. Elias looked at the same ground and saw the absolute lifeblood of the future. He had built a fortress, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I folded the documents carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. The silence of the desert suddenly felt entirely different. It was no longer empty. It was loaded. Outside, the heavy crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the quiet. The drive into town felt longer than usual. The heavy manila envelope sat on the passenger seat of my truck, a quiet anchor in the rattling cab. I needed someone who understood Nevada water law, not a strip mall divorce lawyer. That meant Marcus. His office was located above a failing dry cleaner, smelling faintly of stale coffee and exhausted paper. Marcus pushed his glasses up his forehead and traced the watermarked lines of my grandfather's documents. He did not smile or offer congratulations. He just leaned back and delivered a clinical assessment. The commercial tap rights were valid, and they were worth at least $18.5 million. But securing that value against a $750 million tech conglomerate was going to be an absolute bloodbath. They will bury you in injunctions until you starve, Marcus told me, tapping his pen against the desk. He was not trying to scare me. He was simply doing the math. He needed a $15,000 retainer just to file the initial defensive blocks. Looking back now, I realized that was the exact moment the romantic illusion of the underdog died. We are conditioned to believe that holding the truth is enough to secure a victory. But justice in the real world is not a cinematic montage of triumphant courtroom speeches. It is a grueling, mechanical transaction. It requires heavy capital, and thanks to the divorce settlement, I had exactly 0 liquid assets left. I drove back to the garage and pulled the heavy canvas tarp off the 1969 Mustang. I had spent 4 years rebuilding that engine, painstakingly sourcing original parts, pouring my quiet weekends into its restoration. I sold it to a local collector for $45,000 in a fire sale. It was easily worth double that on the open market, but I needed the liquidity for Marcus's retainer immediately. If I am being honest, handing the title over to a local collector 2 days later felt like severing a limb. It hurt worse than signing the divorce papers, because this sacrifice was entirely my own choice. I wired the $15,000 to Marcus the next morning, buying myself a seat at a very dangerous table. The corporate retaliation was swift and entirely devoid of emotion. Vanessa's legal team did not ask for a negotiation. They unleashed a synchronized mechanical assault. Certified letters began piling up on my workbench. They threatened eminent domain claims, citing regional economic development priorities. Marcus dismissed the threat immediately. A private data center isn't a public utility like a highway or a school. Their bluff only proved how desperate they were to rattle a man they thought didn't know his rights. They filed obscure zoning violations regarding the structural integrity of my grandfather's garage, forcing expensive municipal inspections. They dragged Marcus into endless preliminary hearings designed solely to drain my hard-won retainer. The weeks bled into the rust of the garage, measured only in the mounting pile of legal notices and the steady depletion of my bank account. By the end of the 3rd month, the physical toll of the stress was heavy. I was rationing food again and running entirely on fumes, wondering how much longer Marcus could hold the line, and then a single letter arrived via private courier. It was a back-channel offer from Vanessa's division, bypassing the heavy litigation for a quiet, immediate surrender. $2 million in clean cash to walk away right now. 4 months of legal warfare will break a man. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth at a highway diner, staring at the printed contract for $2 million. Vanessa's back-channel offer was sitting right next to my lukewarm coffee. It was an escape hatch, perfectly engineered to look like a lifeline. If I am being honest, the temptation to sign my name and walk away was a physical ache in my chest. $2 million meant an end to the anxiety. It meant I could buy my life back, find a quiet shop somewhere else, and never look at another municipal injunction again. But signing that paper meant admitting that my grandfather's foresight was just another asset for her to strip away. Marcus slid into the booth across from me. He looked worse than I did, carrying a thick manila folder that he dropped onto the Formica table. He did not ask how I was doing. He just opened the folder and tapped a single sheet of paper with his pen. Shipping manifests, Marcus said, his voice raspy from lack of sleep. Public records from the Port Authority and heavy transport logs. I looked at the highlighted lines. I did not understand what I was seeing at first. Hundreds of millions of dollars in highly sensitive server equipment were scheduled for delivery to the new data center site in exactly 30 days. They are breaking ground on the server racks, Marcus explained, leaning forward. But you cannot run a mega data center without massive cooling infrastructure. And they cannot build the cooling towers without securing the water rights first. At the time, I did not realize how corporate intimidation actually functions. Large institutions manufacture a false sense of inevitability to panic their opponents into quick surrender. They bury you in legal jargon, threaten eminent domain, and impose arbitrary deadlines to make you feel entirely powerless. They project an image of an unstoppable machine to mask their internal bleeding. But the reality was hidden right there in the shipping logs. Their rigid corporate schedules were their greatest vulnerabilities. Vanessa's legal team was not crushing me because they were confident They were burying me in paperwork because they were absolutely terrified. The clock was ticking, and they had 30 days before a logistical bottleneck cost the conglomerate hundreds of millions of dollars in delayed operations. My grandfather had known that the desert teaches you survival is not about moving fast. It is about holding your ground when the drought comes. Time was no longer my enemy. Time was the heavy leverage I needed to force a structural collapse. I slid the $2 million buyout offer back across the table toward Marcus. The relief that washed over me was cold and clinical. I was no longer fighting a war. I was simply watching their supply chain fracture. Marcus pulled out his laptop right there in the diner, connecting to the spotty wireless network. He drafted a single-line email to Vanessa's lead corporate counsel and hit send. My client is no longer entertaining buyout offers. If your cooling towers require water, we will discuss a lease on our terms. The final surrender did not happen in a boardroom. It happened on a sterile, pixelated video call in Marcus's cramped office on a Tuesday morning. There were no cinematic shouting matches, no dramatic slamming of heavy folders on polished mahogany tables. There was only the mechanical hum of an overworked laptop fan and a grid of digital faces. Richard, the senior executive overseeing the entire infrastructure rollout for the tech conglomerate, had been forced to the table. Vanessa was there too, occupying a small, silent, rectangular box in the bottom corner of the screen. Marcus controlled the pacing of the meeting. He dictated the mechanics of a heavily restricted conservation lease with surgical precision. We were not selling a single grain of dirt. They would pay $18.5 million over a 30-year term for capped, highly regulated commercial extraction limits. The contract included annual inflation escalators, ensuring the lease payments maintained their full value against the shifting economy of the future. Furthermore, the title to the land and the aquifer beneath it remained absolutely and entirely in my name. If I am being honest, I expected a fight. I braced myself for Richard to deploy another wave of corporate intimidation, to threaten endless litigation or attempt to bleed my depleted retainer dry through regulatory appeals. But leverage is a cold mathematical equation. Because of their looming hardware delivery and their absolute failure to secure cooling infrastructure beforehand, they had zero operational runway left. Richard stared through the webcam, his face an unreadable mask of bottom-line pragmatism. He gave a sharp single nod and accepted the terms without a single counteroffer. It was a purely transactional capitulation. I kept my eyes on Vanessa's video feed. For 12 years, she had controlled the volume of my life, directing our marriage like a project manager, optimizing a supply chain. She had engineered our divorce as a quiet acquisition tactic, weaponizing my desire for peace to secure her corporate bonus. Now, she was entirely sidelined. I noticed the small red microphone icon next to her name. She was muted. Richard had issued a direct mandate before the call. Vanessa was there as a silent witness to her own failure, stripped of any authority to speak or intervene. The red microphone icon wasn't a technical glitch, it was a leash. Richard had bypassed her completely, rendering her a mere spectator to the deal she had tried to steal. Richard had forced her to attend the call to sign off on her own massive oversight, a corporate punishment designed to make her witness the cost of her failure. She sat there and watched her acquisition bonus, her professional status, and her perceived superiority evaporate in absolute silence. She could not even speak in her own meeting. It took me years to understand that true power does not need to scream, demand apologies, or gloat over a victory. You do not need to actively destroy an adversary to win a war. Sometimes, the ultimate closure is simply holding your ground and watching them realize their own profound irrelevance. The escrow instructions were forwarded to the bank. The legal standoff that had consumed my life for 4 grueling months was dismantled in less than 20 minutes. In the world of high-stakes litigation, 4 months is an eye blink, but for a corporation staring at $100 million delay, it was an eternity. They didn't settle because they were tired, they settled because their time had run out. The digital signatures processed across the screen, and the war was over. After Marcus finalized the trust and we set aside a heavy reserve for the IRS, the numbers on the screen finally felt like a legacy rather than just a legal victory. I did not go out and buy a mansion in the hills or a depreciating luxury yacht. I sat on the cracked concrete steps of the garage, holding a cold bottle of beer, and watched the desert sun sink below the horizon. The digital signatures were locked, the corporate machinery had retreated, and the air around me finally felt entirely my own. The very next morning, I made a single phone call. I tracked down the local collector who had purchased my 1969 Mustang. I wired him an offer he could not logically refuse, and by the weekend, that heavy, beautiful machine was parked exactly where it belonged, right in the center bay of my newly upgraded, fully funded restoration shop. Buying it back was not an act of pride, it was an act of reclamation. I was buying back the pieces of my identity I had been forced to liquidate just to survive the legal meat grinder. It took me a long time to understand the fundamental difference between the woman I married and the grandfather who left me this dirt. Vanessa operated on the assumption that power was simply a matter of taking things from people who refused to fight back. Her entire worldview was extractive, constantly mining value from the path of least resistance. Grandpa Elias understood a much older, quieter truth. He knew that true leverage is never defined by what you can take from others. It is defined by what you are absolutely willing to protect for yourself. If I am being entirely honest, the profound peace I feel today did not arrive with the initial transfer of millions. It arrived the moment I realized I no longer feared her manufactured urgency. I did not destroy her life. I simply stopped allowing her to use my life as the raw material to build hers. When you finally close the account on a manipulative relationship, the silence that follows is not empty, it is heavily capitalized. The desert teaches you a hard lesson. Survival is not about moving fast, and it is certainly not about retreating to keep the peace. It is about holding your ground when the drought comes. If you are currently sacrificing your own stability to keep the peace with someone who is quietly at war with you, please remember this. The only boundary a manipulative person will ever respect is the one they cannot physically break. Have you ever experienced a moment where you had to stop retreating and finally secure your own borders? If this story resonated with your own lived experience, I would truly value hearing your perspective in the comments below.